Yep.
All right. Welcome to CHI's Unlearning Our Loneliness. This is week 2, the space for love. A little bit of review before we jump in. Last week, we talked about the need to become considerate and ways that learning to consider others' sufferings and pain would help us to unlearn loneliness. And this is especially true given the isolating nature of pain, which is difficult to express using words. This week, we're examining a rather odd story by Miranda July called The Sister. The plot of the story involves a lonely man who learns to have sex with another man, a coworker named Victor, due to Victor's deceptions regarding a fictional sister named Blanca. Given the way that Victor's passions were able to transfer from Blanca to Victor quite quickly, even though there's a chemical catalyst involved, my question for the week regards, how can one who is alone learn to make space for love? So that's the question that we're going to explore through the story. And we will start on page 39. Or do you have a question first? Okay. All right. We'll start on page 39. The story is written in the first person from the perspective of the old man, who remains unnamed throughout the story. He writes, quote, "Many times people have asked if I'd like to meet their sister. Some women never marry, and the years don't tiptoe around them. These women, they have brothers, and the brothers often know a man like me, a man who is alone." The narrator clarifies, quote, "I had never been in love with anyone, dead or alive." This is part of why I think the narrator serves as a good example to contemplate in a class on unlearning loneliness, because it starts with the lonely, unloving subject. It's just a guy. Doesn't love, he's alone, and he knows that about himself, and he's okay with that for the most part. Okay, his life, more or less, just constitutes a full circle, right? I mean, there's just nothing that breaks in, nothing that gets into there. It's just full. It's him. That's his life. Page 40. Before discussing his job, the narrator describes why lonely men aren't introduced to younger women. Quote, "I can tell you in one word why this is. Rape." Unquote. It's perhaps unfair, but it's also possibly in the neighborhood of the truth. The narrator then describes his co-worker, Victor Cesar Sanchez, who had, with the narrator, achieved the dubious distinction of having worked at Deegan Leather for over 20 consecutive years. Given his lonely life, the narrator, quote, "didn't know the name of Victor's wife until she died last year. It was Caroline." Further, he writes, quote, "I did not know he had a sister until he asked, 'Do you want to meet my sister?' Her name was Blanca Cesar Sanchez." And that's where the sister comes into the picture. Page 41. The narrator forgets that he's old. That's established on page 40 when he admits that, quote, he's taken aback to see such a tall, elderly sister when he meets sisters these days. Then on 41, it's not a shock that the narrator, quote, "made the mistake of imagining her, Blanca, as a teenager in a white dress, new little breasts. I did want to meet her." It's a fantasy that transforms Blanca into a sexualized object that he knows and does not realize is a mistake. But there's desire, and the desire allows the narrator to okay a meeting, right? But what's tricky about it is he always is aware of the fact that Blanca is not a teenager. Nonetheless, every time he thinks about Blanca, it's as though she were a teenager. So he always has both of those things in mind, what she is and what she's not, or he pictures her as a teenager, even though he's aware that that's not how it is. He has no other picture of her, so that's the image that pops into mind. So Victor agrees to introduce them at an AIDS benefit party, a party that had a lot of people who may have been Blanca. The narrator writes, quote, "Many times I saw Victor, and he told me that he had just seen his sister, but lost her again." Victor asks the narrator what he thought about the sister, and they have the following exchange. "I didn't meet her." "Oh, I thought you said you had." "No, I said I had not. I had not." "Well, this is a shame. I think she left. She told me she liked you." "What?" "She said she wants to see you again." "But I never met her." "Watch it. That's my sister you're talking about." That's the end of the conversation. The perceptive reader at this point likely suspects that there's something fishy about Blanca, especially given Victor's emphasis that she liked him and the inability to accept that they never met. Right? There seems to be something off about Blanca, but the reader's not really quite sure what's going on. Page 42. July then shows the narrator continuing to develop a relationship with the sister. But it's a relationship predicated more on fantasy than actuality. This process introduces the possibility of a romantic object that's particularized, although it remains in a space of possibility rather than becoming a particular object. So what the sister does is it creates just a space, right? There's a space called Blanca, and it's not particular, it's just particularized, right? So Blanca does not line up with any particular one. There's no one woman who is Blanca. They all could be Blanca as long as they're teenage, but even the teenagers can't be Blanca. They're probably the older ones, but they're not necessarily. Anybody's Blanca, right? But the space is not particular to a person, but it's a particular space, right? And so when he thinks about Blanca, it's in very particular terms, even though the notion of the sister remains completely abstract. Does that make sense? It's a space, right? It's like it's like all the qualities that he wants to be true of the sister get put into a space, and the more qualities he attributes to the sister go into that space, but there's nothing concrete that it fixes to. So it remains this space. It's general. It's particular, right? It's framed. It's not just a wide open space, but there's this. It just circumscribes a particular space which makes up Blanca. It's not a person. It's not filled in. It's just a space. Does that make more sense? Okay. We'll keep working on it. All right. The narrator writes, quote, Blanca came in and out of my life over the next few weeks, but she never came in far enough for me to see her. I failed to meet her in so many different ways that I began to know her anyway. I dressed up for it. I knew the qualities of her particular absence. Right? Her absence is a particular one. It's not a general absence, it's her absence. She's the one who's not here, even though he's never seen her. He knows what her absence is like. Does that make a little bit more sense? It's it'll build. I dressed up for it. I wore a suit that I'd never gotten the hang of in the 70s, but now it felt off-white. It became a uniform for not meeting Blanca. The knowledge, of course, is still wholly abstracted. He has a relationship with a space that's designated by the character name Blanca. And this space for a relationship causes the narrator to do things, right? It's just a space, it's not a person, but it still has causal influence over his life. So he dresses up, he goes to different establishments, things like that. The narrator asks Victor to have Blanca introduce herself because, quote, I see her in my dreams. Victor asks what she looks like, and the narrator can only say, she's an angel. Victor affirms that it must be her, right? Oh, the angel, yeah, that's got to be her. And again, angel is incredibly abstract, right? There's nothing particular about angel. And so it's something that Victor can say, yep, that's her. The narrator presses, is she blonde? No, she's dark-haired like me. A brunette? Well, I don't know about that. You said she was. Yeah, I just don't like to hear my sister talked about in that way. Which again, weird, right? Victor's kind of an odd guy. You get the sense that there's something a little off about Victor. Page 43. The way that he said brunette is expanded on the next page, on page 43. And this also sets up the narrator's increasing openness and dependence on the space of love that's opened by the fantasy of Blanca. Right? Blanca is still wholly a fantasy. It's abstract space. It's a character name that has nothing definite, nothing particular associated to it. Nonetheless, that fantasy of Blanca, which becomes repeated and repeated and repeated, starts to open up a space for love within the narrator. He says, quote, brunette, and this is why he didn't like the that way. Victor didn't like the that way. Brunette said by a man who has to use 2 hands to jerk off each night. That's what she did to me. I knew when she was near because I started breathing harder. But she's never near, right? It's the nearness is still, the space becomes close, not Blanca. The whole feeling in the room changed. Her smell wrapped itself around my face, and I just knew she was there, and I couldn't stop thinking she was a teenager, even though it made no sense. In many ways, the narrator's relationship resembles something that we might consider love. Maybe lust or desire, but love also changes our physiology, and it quickens our sexual excitement. Proximity matters. When one's beloved is near, one breathes harder, right? One's pulse pounds. Your breath gets tight. The question of smells, the ability for the beloved to change the feeling in the room, these seem consistent with the visceral experience of love, right? Okay. Here, the narrator remains aware that it's all a fantasy. His desire is for a teenage fantasy, and the fantasy continues. Quote, I could just see her in tight jeans and tennis shoes, chewing gum, with pierced ears and some sort of band holding her hair back. And pierced ears. The fantasy is not a pornographic one, but it's still a fantasy, right? It's a mundane fantasy, and it's as realistic a picture of a teenage girl as the old man is able to get. It's generic, with very few details that are worked in, but then the narrator adds, quote, some may say that such a girl is not ready for a relationship with a man, especially a man in his late 60s. But to that I say, we don't know anything. So who are we to say how to love? I wouldn't force her. I wouldn't have to. She would want me. We would be in love. What do you know? You don't know anything. Pretty convenient. And because it's a space without particularities, it's easier for him to attribute an equivalent desire from her part for him, right? Because it's abstract. It's fantasy. And so as long as he's having a fantasy, he's able to embrace its possibility in the face of knowledge. Right? He's aware it's a fantasy, so even though he knows better, he can still hold on to the fantasy as a fantasy. Most of us do this when we're considering a lover. We tend to think of what would allow the relationship to work and not focus on obstacles or problems. Right? We have the fantasy or the ideal of the relationship that we want to have true, and that stands in front of the actual human being who may or may not have those attributes. Right? The space comes before the person. Does that make sense? Not yet? Okay. Well, we'll keep working through it. Our own feeling of love seems uniquely equipped to overtake the impossible or the unlikely. From being fine alone, the narrator begins to discover, quote, many times a day when I needed her, end quote, and describes it as day after day, no flaws, just a building tension, a growing fog that could be cut only by a backward step or a missing buckle, right? Because he's still working in the purse factory. So, you know, the backward strap, the missing buckle, things like that. Those are the only things that interrupt because he has Blanca in his life now. Although the narrator's still alone, and although he has actually to meet Blanca, his fantasies about her have become part of his daily routine. How he understands his day now centers around his fantasy of Blanca. And even though Blanca remains a character in a fantasy space, that fantasy space now has a place within him and within his day. It's still a space, it's still a whole, it's still an openness to Blanca. It's a particular openness to her, but it's within him now. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 44. The fantasy aspect becomes centralized within the narrator. He writes, quote, I called out to my own heart as if she were within me like an egg, white like an egg, and not quite ready, about to be like an egg. The relationship is one that concerns his own heart, and it's still one that's waiting to be born in the flesh, right? It hasn't hatched, it hasn't emerged yet. It's there, but not born. It's present, but still absent in its full potential. But he's invested in it, like his own heart. It's within him, but it's not out in the open yet. It hasn't come, it hasn't emerged. The narrator then switches to discuss Victor. And the text discloses how the imaginary object, Blanca, begins to overlap with the person of Victor, right? So you have Victor, this is going to become Victor. He's a nice guy. There's Victor, and here's the space of Blanca. And what he does in page, or what July does in 45, is to allow these two to start coming together, so that Victor and the space of Blanca start to blur just a little bit. He writes, quote, I had never thought much about Victor, but now he became this exciting person because he was Blanca's brother. Victor thought of me differently too, more as a member of his family, as if Blanca and I were already a couple. End quote. Victor becomes exciting by virtue of his proximity to Blanca. He's a conduit for the narrator's excitement. He causes the narrator to become excited by virtue of the fact that Blanca comes along with him. The space of Blanca overlaps with him. Thus, when Victor sees the narrator sees Victor, he gets the excitement through the space of Blanca that it's attached to Victor. Does that make sense? Okay. Victor invites the narrator to meet his parents, who are confused when the narrator asks where the daughter is. A picture on the wall of the mother reminds the narrator of Blanca. There are no pictures of young girls of any kind in the house. Page 45. The narrator reflects on his experience of love, and he says this, quote, I had never been in love. I had been a peaceful man, but now I was caught in agitation. I accidentally hurt myself with my own body, as if I were two clumsy people fighting. I held on to some things too tightly, let go of others, things too suddenly. Victor sat with me at lunch all week and tried to interest me in things that were not interesting. Finally, he invited me over to his apartment to have drinks with Blanca. I could tell this was it. I wore the same thing I'd worn all the other times I thought I was going to meet her, but this time I was more careful. I tucked my shirt into my boxers before I pulled up my pants, and when I pulled them up, they stroked the hairs on my leg. I was noticing everything. I was electric. Blanca, of course, was late. So Victor, at this point, especially the second time through the story, you pick up on the fact that Victor's pretty interested in the narrator, right? He wants to spend time with the narrator, wants the narrator to become interested in the things that interest Victor, but the narrator is all about Blanca. And so finally, Victor just says, come on over, let's have drinks with Blanca. And that charges the narrator up. He's electric, he's excited. And he's so obsessed with Blanca that the narrator never notices Victor as a person who might have an interest in him, right? He just doesn't think through that because he's all about Blanca. He's totally fixated on Blanca. But this marks a new step for the narrator, as he's able to distance his fantasy from himself, and that notion of, or the gap between the fantasy, Blanca being within him, and the fact that Blanca might become something external, I suggest is that notion of two people fighting with each other inside of him, right? The fantasy is starting to take on a life of its own. It's detaching from his insides. And as soon as Blanca is able to become externalized as a real outside figure, that still leaves a space within him that will allow for an actual relationship. He no longer exists in a hermetically sealed universe. He's been opened by the fantasy of Blanca. Is this making more sense? Okay. 46. At midnight, Victor says she's coming and that he had gotten ecstasy for the narrators to share with her so that he will be nice and loose with Blanca. The narrator asks if she's, quote, like a wild, out-of-control teenager, end quote, and Victor affirms this suspicion. You know she is. The narrator then establishes that she's 17. Page 47. They take the ecstasy and they listen to country music as they wait. The narrator writes, quote, I thought about Blanca and I could feel her coming closer. I could almost hear her shoes on the street below, the sound of her running up the stairs and the door flying open. I imagined this again and again, hoping the door would fly open at the exact moment that I imagined it flying open, and it would be part of a dream come true. The music, the cowboy, was part of this, made the air thicker, like I was thinking on the outside of my head. And that's that same notion of externalization, right? Blanca's on the outside of his head. She's tactile. She's in the world outside of him, and not just something that he both knows and does not know is not true. So the narrator starts talking to Victor and says that Victor is like the cowboy, and they have an interesting kind of exchange. That's me, all right. You hear the sadness in my voice. I do. There's a lot of sadness in me. I can hear it. I think you've got a similar pain. I do. I want to see her so bad, Victor. But what happens here is important. Victor isn't lying, right? He and the narrator both share a sense of loneliness and emptiness. It's the loneliness of unrequited love, the space that emerges, which is caused by the haunting possibility of a lover that has not yet materialized as a lover. Victor pushes forward his relationship with the narrator by doing what we discussed last week. He helps the narrator consider that he and Victor share a similar pain, right? And so like we talked about with David Foster Wallace, if you have the narrator, we have Victor, what Victor does is help the narrator see that he has the same kind of structure. And it's painful, right? And what Victor does is help the narrator see that the pain that he has and the emptiness that he has is reflected in somebody else in the world. They share the same pain. I mean, for the narrator, it's all about Blanca, but he can understand the fact that another human being has feelings the way that he does, and he can consider the pain of another person. Huge step for the narrator, right? You don't get the impression that the narrator is probably the most empathetic person in the universe. But now he's open, and he can understand the pain of another. Does that make sense? Okay. So to agree to the thought of a shared emotional space with another, even though this isn't shared in the way he believes, is huge. And that's what that constitutes. It's the shared emotional pain with another. He accepts that invitation. Page 48. Instead of showing the narrator a picture of Blanca, Victor pulls him onto the couch. Quote, I sat beside Victor, and I knew it was happening, the drugs. He held my hand, and I rubbed his arm harder and harder, and it felt okay. But then the rubbing was all of us, the whole length of our giant old selves. It was like a humping thing. The narrator pushes Victor away, worried that Blanca would enter. You're her brother. Victor asks the narrator to take his shirt off, saying that the pants can stay on. Or the pants can stay on. And the narrator says, are you gay? I said the pants can stay on. When did the drugs stop? If I drink water, do they stop sooner? Just let this happen. It's okay. Just let it happen. There's no Blanca. Finally, right? He comes out and actually says it. Victor totally dodges the question of homosexuality, right? It's not what this is about. It's not about whether he has this kind of sexual identity or not. Victor's not worried about that. He's just interested in the narrator for who the narrator is. For whatever reason, right? That interest is there. And given the absolute unreality of their conversations about Blanca, the fact that there is no Blanca, not a surprise, right? You're not shocked by this revelation. Were you? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, but does it make sense now?
Yeah.
How July sets up the fact that she's not quite as real as the narrator wants? The narrator has trouble with it, though. Quote, I didn't believe him for 3 hours. I sat in Victor's bedroom, and he stayed on the couch, and we waited for the drugs to stop, and I waited for Blanca. When the drugs were over, I suddenly knew he was right. It was as if I had been on the drug for the last 3 months, and now I was back. I came out of the bedroom and sat on the couch. The space of love functioned as an intoxicant for the narrator. It felt good. It was a feeling. And the feeling of a connection, even if it was a connection with the fantasy, was so new and so missed that the narrator ignored fairly obvious facts about Blanca's non-existence. Right? The fact that her mother doesn't know what she's talking about. Like, that's pretty big. The fact that she's never there. You know, like all these things add up. The narrator never puts them together because it feels really good to have a connection outside of the self. And the narrator wasn't lonely before the story started. He was alone but not lonely. Right? But he had to learn his loneliness before he could unlearn it. He might not have felt lonely, but the loneliness was still there, right? He just sealed it off by refusing any sort of consideration or openness to the world. Once he learned to have a space to the world, he could learn his loneliness by never seeing Blanca, and only then was he able to unlearn. Make sense? Okay. Page 49. The narrator asks why Victor introduced him to his parents, and Victor replies, quote, "I wanted them to meet you before they died." Sweet. With that, the narrator writes, quote, "It felt like the air was multiplying, and I couldn't even think about what Victor said because I was so worried I wouldn't be able to keep up with the air." Victor starts quizzing the narrator about his sexual history, asking about the girls and about teenagers, and the narrator replies that he doesn't meet them, he just thinks about it. The narrator's honest. He doesn't like grown women. He's had sex with a woman, he just doesn't like them. Victor then asks, what about a man? The narrator says no, and then, quote, "Victor brought his arms around me, and I felt sick in my stomach, and my cock felt sick too. It felt feverish and painful, and I rubbed it just to clear my head. Victor rubbed it too, with tears on his cheeks and lips. The tension in the air, that buzzing, that thickness coalesces, but there's no indication of homosexuality or intentionality, right? Like in terms of like identity politics or those kinds of markers, those aren't things that July is necessarily interested in. I mean, another reader might be able to read a way that that's very present, but in this reading of it, it doesn't seem like it's about being gay. It seems about the narrator's relationship with Victor, and more importantly, Victor's relationship with the narrator. And how Victor wants to help the narrator break out of that cage and learn how to be lonely so he can then unlearn that loneliness. That's what that seems to be about. Page 50. I think this page is incredibly interesting. The narrator writes, quote, "I wanted to punch him, punch a hole right through him, and then fill that hole with my body. And I was doing that. He was sobbing now the way Blanca would sob, like a child. When I came on the couch. I didn't want to come inside it because of what the sperm can do. But he ate it off the couch, and then he kissed me with a deep tongue. So whatever sperm can do, it was doing to me. We slept. It was the sleep of 100 years. And when we woke, it was still night." It's a weird sex scene. And it's likely because the narrator has a weird sex life. I'm interested, though, in that the fact of the hole that July mentions. The narrator understands sex as requiring a space, and the space is when he thinks of introducing in violence. To punch a hole, and to fill the hole with his body. It's also a moment of identification. Filling Victor's body with his own, which allows him to inhabit another person's space, to become one with the other, and ultimately to become the other. Right? To punch a hole in Victor so big that he can put his body in it and become Victor. It's an extreme moment of identification. There's no space left, right? I mean, that space of love, this space totally disintegrates because he wants to fill Victor's body with his own. The other, in this case, is someone who desires sexual intimacy, someone who has made space for the narrator to enter. At the moment of sex, as Victor cries, the narrator is reminded of a Blanca he now knows to be fictitious. It's as close as the narrator can come to having sex with Blanca, which is as close as he can get to having intimacy. Sex with Victor is abbreviated but still shared. He receives his own sperm from Victor's tongue willingly, and they sleep together. But the machinations of the hole and the violence and the punching and the filling and the removal of all space and all difference is weird. It's the first stumbling steps toward another. When they wake, the narrator wants to talk about work and grommeting. Quote, "Everything seemed ordinary, even overly ordinary. There was a fly in the room, and it buzzed around in a way that told us nothing amazing had ever happened in this place. I knew if I said something about this, if I said the word grommeting, then everything would be as it had been, forever. Amen. And I mean, everybody knows what a grommet is. It's it's just a little hole for something to go through. Yeah. Right? That's a grommet. A grommet is a kind of hole. It's space. The narrator lacks the capacity to know how to discuss what has happened. Right? Narrator's not there. He can't theorize intimacy or love or things like that. It's a kind of sex he had never known himself to want to have. It's sex with an adult. It's sex with a man. These are not things that he has ever fantasized or thought about doing before in his life. It took place under the fog of ecstasy and in the presence of heartbreak. The key term, though, that will allow his reality to snap back into familiarity is grommeting. And again, it's a word that refers to how one places a grommet. Right? Grommeting is the placement of a grommet in a particular location. It's a hole. It's a space. In the space, the hole, the grommet, remains as unsayable as the experience itself. Quote, I was about to say grommeting. The word grommeting was pulling up from the wet darkness under my throat. The G was coming forth with the grimace that makes the G sound. But in that instant, the buzzing fly lurched toward my ear, and with animal reaction, fierce and unthinking, I swung at it and knocked over the lamp. It broke more than was fitting, crashing and shattering as if it were a lamp 12 times its size. In a final gesture, the bulb exploded in fireworks that fell quietly, extinguishing themselves. The narrator's unleashed and creates the fireworks that he didn't know how to have with another. Right? They're external fireworks. They're not connected to the sex, but they're not disconnected from it either. These occur instead of his articulation of the word. Right? He can't say grommeting. The lamp gets knocked over. Things explode, and he can't say grommeting. Page 51. We said nothing, but the sudden return of darkness seemed to be a question, raised like eyebrows, waiting. Whatever I did next, whatever I said would decide me. I didn't say grommeting, but the G stayed in my throat, gathering voice. I growled, and Victor turned to me right away, pressing against my neck. The new life came easily after that, a growl. The suggestion is that the narrator's new life has something to do with Victor, presumably in some sort of homosexual partnership created in the space of grommeting, a space suspended in a growl. This growl, perhaps, is as close as the narrator can come to announcing his love. The narrator's body exceeds his capacity for language. And in this case, as the narrator can only undergo his love, he cannot understand what it is that he experiences. His body can get the love that his mind can't fathom and that his words can't articulate. He can experience it, he can undergo it, but he can't understand it. It's voiceless and primitive, and it's lodged in the space of a whole. Does that make more sense?
I'm getting the impression that the narrator wants to become Victor. No?
Maybe. And there's a weird, there's that sense of identification or ultimate identification makes it seem like that, right? There's space to interpret it that in that way. Or when he's talking about the cowboy also, right? That kind of, the image of the cowboy also suggests that the narrator wants to become Victor, right? Victor is his ego ideal. And the closest way that he can become Victor is to have sex with him. Mm-hmm. That's not wrong. And in some ways, I'll put Victor back up here again. If the narrator desires Victor, right? And remember, love is always has an element of desire involved in it, right? The desire for Victor and the desire to be Victor are kind of hard to distinguish. Right? What does he want? He wants the qualities of Victor that he desires. I mean, he can get them through talking, he can get them through sex. He wants to be Victor. Well, how? By doing Victor. Doing equals being. In a weird sort of way. I mean, you can see that, right? Though how the qualities of wanting to be could look like desire for, and it just blurs. And especially with a narrator who has very limited abilities to articulate what intimacy means, it would make sense that those might be confused. Yeah, that's a really good question. Does that make sense as a response? Okay. All right. Final thoughts. Number 1, space. July indicates the slow path toward unlearning loneliness. Although the precise circumstances are perhaps difficult to replicate, the steps seem to be something like this. Number 1, the creation of a mental space for a love object. You can't love until you have space mentally to conceive of an object of love that would be outside of yourself. Number 2, allowing the absence of that space to become a more pronounced presence. Right? A space is a whole, it doesn't exist. So allowing that absence to become more and more present throughout one's days and nights.
Would you repeat that? Number 2 is to allow absence.
The absence of the space to become a more pronounced presence in one's life.
Thank you.
Right? Because right now, Leslie isn't here. Leslie is absent, but I knew she wouldn't be here. So her absence isn't the same kind of absence as it would be if I thought she were coming. Right? And so, but it's to have that absence be the kind of presence where you expect it to be there. And that's the kind of absent presence that number 2 is. The space is an absence, but that absence becomes more and more present in each day of your life. Number 3, allowing the fantasy space to overlap with an external physical body. Right? If I have the space for the kind of woman I want to be in a relationship with, and I have this space, right? I want this woman to maybe look like this or that, or be like this or that, or be interested in this or that. That's a space, right? That's the kind of space or the kind of person I'll be open to receiving at a romantic level. Once that space affixes or lands on a physical external body, then that opens up the way to have that relationship. But it starts with this space here, it becomes externalized, and then it becomes physically determined and concretized in someone's body. This is not the only way to love. This is this way to love. I mean, there are other ways to do it.
Would you please repeat number 3?
Yeah. It's allowing the fantasy space to overlap with an external physical body. And then number 4, finally, allowing that space to become shared with another. And that makes sense, right? So philosophers have long understood that nothingness is required for us to experience becoming rather than simply being. Right? If everything is, nothing cannot be. I mean, this goes all the way back to Parmenides. So, I mean, there needs to be some sort of nothingness that enters into the world that allows for things to change or develop or occur or become. In order for there to be motion or progress or development, we need space. So it is also with love. Before we can love, we need to allow there to be room for love in our lives. Space is the necessary precondition for love. And I don't know if did you watch the movie Swingers? It came out back in like '95. It's about swing dancing. John Favreau, Heather Graham. It's about a guy who can't get over his girlfriend, and he's really, really sad. And as soon as he lets her go, then there's space for love, and then he can meet somebody better, right? I mean, that's all it is. It's right. It's gaining that emotional space that allows you to have a relationship. And until you have that space, you're closed off. Once that space opens, then you're free. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Number 2, fantasy. Although it's easy to dismiss the narrator as driven primarily by fantasy instead of reality, it's not an unknown condition. especially in America. The Ashley Madison scandal, did you hear about this? There's a whole online database for people interested in having affairs. And they found that there were millions of men and hundreds of women who were active on the site. Millions of men, hundreds of women. Looking for partners to cheat with. It was not equal. What they were buying, because you had to pay to be on this website, what they were buying was the fantasy of that a woman would want to have sex with them. And that's all it was. The pornography industry doesn't seem to be lacking in people interested in what they're selling. The difficulty with love, though, is learning to let go of the fantasy and knowing how to invest in a surrounding reality. Fantasy is all over the place, right? It's marketed by everything. I mean, you can't eat a cheeseburger without it being loaded with sexual imagery, especially at Hardee's, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. But you have to know how to let go of that and engage and embrace something real, even though the reality of it is going to differ from the fantasy of it, right? An ideal will always get in the way of the concrete. Nothing's ever as good as it is in your head, except it's better because it's actually in your hand, right? Number 3, sexuality. The narrator's sexuality is primarily bound up in fantasy, especially fantasies that he has no desire to fulfill, right? He's never, ever going to talk to a teenage girl, ever. He has no desire to make his fantasy come true. He wants his fantasy to stay a fantasy because it's safe, right? And the more absurd the fantasy is, the safer it is because there's very, very little chance that reality will ever interrupt him with the kind of space he's looking for. It's not going to happen, right? So his fantasy protects him from love. It shields him from ever stumbling into something that would force him outside of himself. Fantasies keep the narrator safely asexual, leaving him with lust objects that would be impractical to pursue. The fact that Victor was able to become an object of his sexual appetite has far more to do with Victor than it does with the narrator. Victor was able to manipulate the narrator's space of love in ways that he became able to fit inside of it. And if you read through the story again, you can just watch Victor slowly open the space, shift it, shift it, shift it, shift it, and then go into that space. And that's what the story is about, at least in some ways. But at the time he revealed his deception regarding Blanca, Victor had forced the narrator to unlearn his loneliness, and with perhaps equally dubious ethical methods, he taught the narrator pleasures involving sharing one's body with another. Sexual orientation is less relevant than continuing to inhabit the space that Victor had created for him. And that's the space of love. Is that helpful? Do you like the story better now?
Better.
Good. Any other questions?
I have a comment. I was thinking of another rom-com trope that is kind of like played out in this story, or is similar to this story, which is like the super shallow girl that the guy is into throughout the movie because she's way hotter, creates the space for then his best friend to fill once she is revealed to be a sham.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. You know, so it's that formula where, like, oh, I'm in love with this vapid object, not satisfying or fulfilling, but it does. It opens the space. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Anything else?
It was interesting. I forget how you said it at the very beginning. First, he had to become lonely to unlearn his loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just talk a little bit more?
Yeah.
I know you talked all about that, but
Yeah.
just a little more again, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Like first he was just unlovable,
Well,
not
no.
in love and full of being alone.
At first, he's absolute. He's not in relation to anything else in the world. There's no relationship that he has, and the relationship that he does have is a narcissistic pleasure loop, right? It's an unrealizable fantasy. It's never going to be fulfilled, and it allows him to stay connected with only himself. Step 2, the space of Blanca, and here's the narrator, right? Blanca intervenes. And Blanca is something realizable in a way, right? And as her absence becomes more present, he starts to realize that she's not there and he wants her to be there, right? And that's what enters, that's where he has to learn that he's lonely. Here he's alone, but there's no value attached to that. And in fact, that's his preferred state because it's safe. Being lonely is risky, right? Because you want to fix it, you want to solve it, you want to change that situation. And then what Victor does, Blanca is the space of overlap between Victor and the narrator, and that's how he's able to unlearn his loneliness. Does that make more sense? Yeah.
Does Victor become Blanca?
No, because Blanca is a teenage girl who doesn't exist. Right? What is Victor for him? I'm not like you get the sense of the new life, right? With the grommeting and that there's something new that's there, and a growl and things that he can't say. But he's not Blanca, and the narrator knows that. What he is, whether it's his ideal self, right? Like, oh, I want to be like Victor. Great, that's one possibility. Whether it's he just occupies the space that Blanca had, regardless of gender, that doesn't matter, right? The space that I had for love is what he's fulfilling. So in loving Victor, I'm able to just fill that space. And that's something more like him loving Victor as Blanca, but it's still also not that, right? Because he's still Victor, and it's the guy that he works with every day, right? That he grommets with. And so it's still not the teenage girl because that's the fantasy. It's still real, but it's also a really weird kind of relationship.
What is the recognition of pain from the narrator to he recognizes the pain that Victor is feeling? Where does
Here. It's where Victor says to the narrator, we share the same pain.
yeah.
Yeah. So I put that there, right? There's we're lonely, then there's a moment of empathy with another living person.
Yeah.
And then that's able to become physically connected.
Okay.
But the emotional empathy, that kind of considering that we talked about last week, precedes that kind of physical incorporation of love. Anything else?
I don't know if this would fit in, but last time you said some points and I didn't get them all down. And I just wondered if you might have them someplace.
Yeah. Yeah, we can do that after class, but I mean,
Okay,
we'll turn off the camera and
Thank you.